It was late afternoon, the kind of time when the world's tiredness begins to settle into the sky. A gust of wind stirred the dust on the old porch, rustling the leaves in a forgotten corner of the yard. The house, once full of laughter, now stood still, holding secrets it couldn't keep any longer. She had been waiting for hours, staring out the window with eyes that saw the world but didn't quite believe in it anymore. The moment the dog appeared, she didn't think it was real. There was no way that dog was back. It had been years. Her heart quickened, and her breath became shallow. It couldn't be him. Her hands trembled as she opened the door, her face pale. She stepped onto the porch, her feet feeling heavier than before. Each step weighted with the weight of forgotten memories. And then, as if time was willing to catch up, she saw it, an unexpected presence. He was there, trotting towards her with a calmness that only dogs knew. But beside him was something else. A small child, no older than 6 or 7, was clinging to the dog's fur, their face hidden behind the animal's bulk. The child's eyes were dark, their expression unreadable. It was like staring into a shadow. Her breath caught. The dog, her dog, had returned, but with a child no one recognized. She froze, unable to move. It was like the ground beneath her no longer mattered. Time stopped. The child stared up at her, a slight tremble in their tiny hands. For a brief second, there was no noise, only the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. She didn't know how to react. Was this a dream? A nightmare? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her mind scrambled for some explanation, something rational. There was none. The dog wagged its tail and looked at her, as though nothing had ever happened. The child, however, seemed to be a part of a world she didn't understand. What had this dog brought home? And why now? The door was still slightly ajar as she stepped back, eyes not leaving the dog. It didn't make sense. After all these years, why had he returned now? She took another step back, her gaze shifting to the small figure beside him. Who was this child? She felt the weight of the questions pressing on her chest, but she couldn't ask them yet. Not like this. The silence between them seemed almost tangible. Then the child moved slightly, leaning into the dog for reassurance, as if it was the only thing familiar to them. She felt the urge to reach out, to pull the child close and ask where they came from, but the words stuck in her throat. The dog, after all this time, had come back with someone. This was a moment she hadn't prepared for. There was no answer. There was only the dog's soft bark as he nudged the child forward. It was as if the dog was saying, "This is where you belong now." But who had he brought? And how had they ended up here? The wind shifted, bringing a chill with it. It felt like the world was holding its breath. She stepped forward, tentatively, as if testing the ground beneath her. The dog watched her with steady eyes, never faltering. The child, however, didn't move, as though they were waiting for something to happen, perhaps waiting for her to understand. She took another step forward, her heart racing in her chest. The dog didn't flinch. It was like he remembered her, like nothing had ever changed. But she wasn't sure if she could say the same. She was afraid to approach too quickly, afraid that if she got too close, everything would fall apart. What had happened in the time that passed? The years when the dog had gone missing, when the silence had stretched longer than it should have. She could almost hear the sound of his paws again, the echo of his barks from a time before the pain. The child remained still, as if frozen by the unknown. Her eyes flickered over them once more, trying to make sense of the pieces. But there were no answers yet. The air seemed to thicken around her as she reached out a hand, the dog watching her closely. Could it really be him? Could this really be happening? The child's eyes met hers then, dark and knowing, and for a brief second, the past seemed to collide with the present. The dog's ears perked up, and he moved closer to the child, as though reaffirming their bond. They weren't just back, they were here for a reason. The realization hit her with a sudden weight. She wasn't alone anymore. The dog and the child had come home. Her breath steadied as she stood there, waiting for something to happen. She didn't know what to do. The dog was back. The child was here, But what was she supposed to say? What was she supposed to do? The years of waiting, of hoping that somehow the dog would return, had never prepared her for this moment. She wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but all she could do was look at them. There was no rush, no urgency. Just this strange moment where time seemed to stretch between her, the dog, and the child. She wondered if the child knew something she didn't. The way the dog had returned with them, so calm, so unbothered, told her that this wasn't just a coincidence. There was something important here, something she hadn't understood yet. But what? The light faded further, the porch becoming bathed in the soft glow of dusk. The child shifted slightly, the tension in their body easing for just a moment as they looked up at the woman. Something unspoken passed between them, as if the child was trying to tell her something, but the words wouldn't come. She crouched down slightly, trying to bring herself to the child's level. She needed to know. The silence stretched longer than either of them expected. The dog remained by the child's side, unwavering, as though it had never left. The woman's gaze flickered to the child once more, wondering if there was a piece of the past she had forgotten. Maybe the child would remember something. Maybe they could finally make sense of the mess that had become their lives. But the truth was, no one was prepared for this. Not her, not the child, not even the dog. All she knew was that somehow the child had come back, and with them, the dog. But for what purpose? Could it be that the answers were right in front of her, waiting to be discovered? The dog's tail wagged gently, the only sound filling the space between them. Then a voice, small but clear, broke the silence. "He's back," the child said. And just like that, everything shifted. The days stretched on, and still, there was no explanation. The dog, despite its weathered body, seemed content and peaceful, as though it had never been gone. It spent hours lying by the child's side, watching over them with a protectiveness that was almost unnerving. The child, on the other hand, did not speak. No words. Not a single sound. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating, but somehow it didn't feel wrong. The child would sit quietly, gazing into the distance, their eyes unblinking, as if searching for something, or waiting for something. The house had fallen into a strange rhythm. Each day, the dog and the child would remain together, an inseparable pair, while she watched, confused. Why had they returned? Why had the dog come back with the child? The answers eluded her. As the days passed, she tried to push the questions away, focusing on the routine, but every time she looked at them, there was something that tugged at her heart. There was a familiarity in the way the dog moved, in the way the child would sit at the window, gazing out as if they knew the world outside. It was like they had always belonged here. It was hard to ignore, but harder still to confront. One night, while the house slept, she sat by the window, staring into the yard. That was when she saw it. The dog was standing at the gate, watching the road, his ears perked up as if he was waiting for someone. The child stood beside him, the same empty gaze fixed on the horizon. She felt a chill run down her spine. What were they waiting for? The next morning, the child was still there, seated near the door with the dog close by. She walked into the room, unsure of what to do. There was no denying the bond between them. The dog's unflinching loyalty and the child's quiet presence felt like a puzzle piece that had somehow found its place in the house. Still, the silence between them was overwhelming. "You don't have to stay quiet, you know," she said softly, sitting down next to the child. Her voice was gentle, though it felt like she was intruding. The child didn't respond. The dog, however, seemed to shift, sitting up and looking at her with a knowing expression. It was as if the dog understood what she was trying to do. She wanted to reach out, to connect with the child, but something held her back. Was the child afraid? Did they not trust her? There were so many questions, but no answers. In the silence, the room seemed to close in around them. The child finally moved, their fingers brushing the dog's fur as they whispered something under their breath. She didn't catch the words, but they weren't for her anyway. They weren't for anyone. As the day passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding in front of her, something that had been set into motion long before the dog and the child arrived. The house had become a place of waiting. But waiting for what? It wasn't long before the child's movements became more purposeful. They started to explore the house, walking through the rooms with a slow, deliberate pace. Every so often the dog would follow, never too far away, his eyes constantly scanning the environment. The house, once empty and silent, felt alive again. But still, the child didn't speak. It was as if they had forgotten how to. Or perhaps, they never knew how to begin. Every gesture, every movement, was slow and calculated, like the child was piecing together a memory they couldn't quite access. One afternoon, while the dog rested in the corner, the child approached the bookshelf, their small fingers tracing the spines of the old books. It was a gesture that felt oddly familiar, as though the child had done this before, in another time, in another life. She watched in silence, unsure of what to make of it. Was this child connected to the house in a way she hadn't yet understood? Did the dog know something she didn't? As the child pulled a book from the shelf, she walked closer, her footsteps cautious. She cleared her throat, trying to speak, but when the child turned, their eyes met hers with a quiet understanding. It wasn't fear in their gaze. It was something else, something deeper. They slowly handed her the book, their fingers brushing hers for the briefest of moments. She stared at the book in her hands. It was old, its cover worn, and the title barely visible. The child, standing before her, remained silent, their expression unreadable. But it was clear, this moment was important. She could feel it in the air between them. Later that evening, the house was filled with the quiet hum of the wind outside, but inside, there was an unsettling stillness. The child had returned to their spot by the window, the dog lying next to them as they stared out at the horizon. It was as if they were waiting. She didn't understand it. She hadn't understood any of it. But the pieces were starting to come together in her mind, though they were incomplete, disconnected. She couldn't shake the thought that this was all somehow familiar. That the dog, the child, this moment, had been waiting for a long time to return. Her fingers lightly grazed the book still in her hands, the title now visible. The Lost Years. She hadn't realized it at first, but the words were now unmistakable. The child, in their own quiet way, had shown her something. Had they been waiting for her to remember? She opened the book, flipping through the pages, searching for answers. But the pages were empty. The book was nothing more than an echo, a shadow of something she should have known. She closed the book slowly, and looked at the dog who was still lying peacefully beside the child. It wasn't just a return. It was a message. And now, it was up to her to figure out what it meant. The dog, the child, and the book, they were all part of something she had left behind, something she had forgotten. But why had they come back? And why now? The next day brought no answers, only more questions. The child, as always, remained quiet, their gaze distant. The dog never left their side, a constant, silent protector. She couldn't explain it, but she began to feel the weight of their presence, a pressure she couldn't ignore. She decided to speak with the dog, as ridiculous as it seemed. She had no other choice. Sitting on the porch with the dog by her side, she looked out at the empty horizon, hoping for some sign, some clue that could unravel the mystery. "Why now?" she whispered, her voice barely above the wind. The dog only looked at her, his eyes deep and knowing, as though he had lived through countless years of waiting, of searching. The silence was maddening. The child's stillness only deepened the mystery, making the dog's calm presence seem all the more profound. Had they really returned for her? Or was there something else, something more to this strange reunion? The dog's ears perked up, as though hearing something from a distance. She followed his gaze, but there was nothing. Only the empty road ahead. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something she wasn't ready for. As the days continued to pass, the house became a place of constant reflection. She couldn't stop thinking about the book, The Lost Years. There was something about it that felt too deliberate, too pointed. She found herself sitting by the window for hours, the dog lying beside her, always silent, always watchful. The child, still quiet, would occasionally glance at her, their dark eyes full of an understanding she couldn't begin to grasp. Every movement, every glance, every silence, it all felt like a message. It wasn't just the dog returning. It wasn't just the child. It was something much larger, something tied to the house, to this very land. The house had seen so much over the years, and now it seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to understand the truth. The pieces were there, scattered across time, but they were too fragmented to fit together. Late one night, she finally made a decision. She would go through the house, every room, every crevice, every forgotten drawer. She had to uncover what was hidden. She had to find the answer. As she began her search, she found things she'd long forgotten. Photographs, trinkets, old letters. But it wasn't until she reached the attic that she stumbled upon something truly remarkable. There, tucked away in a dusty corner, was a box. The moment she touched it, she felt the weight of it, a feeling that made her heart race. She opened the box slowly, and inside were more photographs, pictures of the dog, pictures of the child, and a letter addressed to her. Her hand shook as she unfolded the letter, and the words on the page were like a bolt of lightning. The letter was from a time long past, written in her own handwriting. It was dated years ago, from a time she could barely remember. Her eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding in her chest as the truth began to take form. "The child was ours, the one we lost," the letter began. "The dog never left them. He has been waiting for you to remember." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, drowning her in a rush of memories she had buried deep within her mind. She had forgotten, or perhaps tried to forget, that they had once had a child, her child. A child who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances and whom no one had ever truly found. The letter continued, detailing the dog's loyalty, its role in protecting the child, and the belief that one day they would return. "He has brought them back to you," the letter concluded. "The dog is the key to everything, remember." She sat frozen, the letter still in her hands, her mind racing to comprehend what she had just read. She couldn't breathe. The child, the one who had returned with the dog, was hers. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a second chance, a gift she hadn't known she would ever receive. But how had they found their way back to her? How had the dog brought the child home? And why hadn't she remembered until now? She clutched the letter tightly, as if it were a lifeline. The dog had been the keeper of this secret, the guardian of a memory she had long since lost. Now, everything was beginning to make sense. But the questions only grew. She spent the entire night in the attic, surrounded by the remnants of a life she had once known. The letter weighed heavily in her hands as the darkness outside deepened. In the quiet of the attic, surrounded by forgotten relics, she finally understood. The child, her child, had returned with the dog, just as the letter had described. But there were still so many questions. Why hadn't anyone found the child all these years? Where had they been? And why had the dog brought them back now, after all this time? She found herself staring at the photographs again, pictures of the dog, younger, with a different version of the child beside him. In the photos they were always together, inseparable, as though the bond between them had never been broken. The dog's eyes, full of love and loyalty, mirrored the ones she had seen just days before. And yet, the child's eyes in the photos were filled with a deep sadness, a haunting emptiness that she now saw reflected in the child standing before her. Was this really the same child? She thought back to the days after the child's disappearance, to the silence that had filled the house. The hope that the child might return had been a distant, almost impossible thought. But here they were, standing in front of her with no explanation. The dog had always known. It had never left them, not for a moment. The silence in the house was suddenly deafening. It was as if the dog and the child were waiting for her to understand, for her to be ready to face what had happened. But the truth, she realized, was far darker than she had ever imagined. The truth was slowly unraveling before her, but she wasn't ready to accept it. The child, the dog, they had always been connected. The bond between them was undeniable, but the deeper she looked into the past, the more horrifying the story became. She pulled another box from the attic, one that seemed to be filled with nothing but old keepsakes, but this one held something else entirely. As she opened it, a faint scent of old paper and dust filled the air. Inside, there were more letters, old, faded, and worn with time. They were from the same period, written in the same handwriting. But these weren't addressed to her. They were addressed to the child. The first letter, yellowed and brittle, contained a simple sentence. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." The next letter was more personal. "The dog will never leave you. He'll protect you, always. I'll find a way back to you." And then the last one was the most disturbing. "I'm coming home, but not the way you think. You will be safe. And together, we will make it right." She stared at the letters in shock. These were not just letters to a lost child. They were written by someone who had known the child intimately, someone who had promised to return, but never did. Who had written these? Why had they been kept hidden for so long? And where was the person who had promised to come back? Her heart raced as the pieces fell into place. There were people involved in this, people who had orchestrated the disappearance of the child. And now they were back. The house was more than just a place of memories. It was a place where dark secrets had been hidden for years. The discovery was too much. She felt overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The dog, the child, the letters. It was as though the house had always known this moment was coming, as if it had been waiting for her to uncover the truth. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. The child's presence, once a mystery, now felt like a constant reminder of something she had lost, a part of herself, a part of her past. The dog had always known. He had never stopped waiting, never stopped protecting. And now, as she looked at the child, she realized that the time had come to finally face the past. The house, the dog, the child, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that had been waiting to be solved for years. But she wasn't sure she was ready to confront what that truth might be. The dog's eyes locked onto hers, steady and knowing. The child stood by the window once more, staring out into the unknown. It was as though they were waiting for her to take the next step, to face whatever had been hidden all these years. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The days felt heavy, like the air was thick with something unspoken. The child had begun to explore the house more actively, moving through rooms as though searching for something. The dog never strayed far, always watching, always close. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were here for a reason, that their return wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if the dog had brought the child back to fulfill some unspoken promise. But what was the promise? What was it that the child and the dog were waiting for? She found herself following them more often than not, watching as the child lingered in corners of the house, their eyes scanning the familiar, yet distant, surroundings. She wanted to ask the child questions, to break through the silence that had hung between them since their arrival. But every time she tried, the child only looked at her with those same empty eyes, eyes that seemed to hold more secrets than she could fathom. The house had changed since they arrived. There was a new energy in the air, an unsettling presence that she couldn't ignore. The dog had always been a part of this home, and now it seemed like the child was too, though neither of them had ever truly belonged here. Yet, the child had returned as if they had never left. The questions remained unanswered, but there was no denying that something significant had shifted. As the night settled over the house, the dog and the child both stared out the window, waiting, as though expecting something to happen. What were they waiting for? And would it change everything? The house felt too still. The silence was louder than ever, and every day that passed without the child speaking made it harder to ignore the growing tension. One afternoon, while the dog rested near the child, she sat in the kitchen, her mind racing. The house had once been full of life, of conversation, of laughter. But now it felt like a waiting room, waiting for something that was yet to come. She tried to engage the child again, this time sitting beside them as they both stared out the window. You know, we used to live here together, she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. You and me and the dog. We were happy. The child didn't respond. Their gaze remained focused on the outside world, distant, unfocused. The dog, however, turned his head and looked at her for a moment, his eyes filled with an intelligence that made her question everything. Was he waiting for her to understand? Waiting for her to remember something long buried? She couldn't shake the feeling that the child knew more than they let on, but it was like trying to reach through a fog. She wanted to ask the child where they had been all these years, what had happened to them. But something in the silence stopped her. It was as if the child couldn't or wouldn't speak about it. And the dog, the ever-watchful companion, didn't seem to be pushing the child either. It was as though there was a reason for the silence. Maybe it was part of the puzzle she hadn't yet unlocked. Maybe the truth was waiting for her to find it. A few nights later, she was woken by a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from the back of the house. She stood in the dark, listening for a moment, unsure if she had imagined it. But then it came again, faint, like someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. The dog, as always, was beside her, his ears perked up as though he had heard it too. The child, however, remained asleep, completely undisturbed. She moved cautiously toward the sound, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. It led her to the back door, the one that had been locked for years. The door creaked open with a hesitant push, and outside, in the faint glow of the moonlight, she saw something that made her freeze. The backyard, which had once been a place of memories, now seemed unfamiliar. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was a figure, a man, or something like one. The dog growled low in his throat, stepping protectively in front of the woman, but the figure didn't move. It stood motionless, like a shadow. Her heart raced as she looked at the dog, who now was staring intently at the figure. It was clear that the dog knew this presence. But who was it? And what did he want? The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. The woman's breath caught in her throat as the dog growled once more, his body stiff with tension. She stepped back, her pulse quickening, unsure of what to do. The figure had no face, no distinguishing features. It was just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees, standing unnervingly still. She didn't know who this was, but the dog clearly did. The silence between them was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and began to walk away, its movements deliberate, as though it had only been waiting for her to notice it. The dog's growling ceased, but his eyes never left the figure. She stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as the figure disappeared into the night. The child had not stirred. For a moment, it felt like the house had returned to its silence, as though nothing had happened. But deep down she knew that something had shifted. The figure had been a warning. Of that much she was certain. But what was it warning her about? The dog, who had never faltered in his loyalty, had known that presence. The question was, why had he never spoken of it? Was the figure someone from the past? Or was it something else entirely? The figure's disappearance left a heavy silence in its wake, but the questions only multiplied. The dog remained by her side, his watchful eyes never leaving the edge of the yard. He knew something, she was sure of it. The child, however, remained untouched by the moment. They continued their quiet routine, as if nothing had happened. It was like they were waiting for her to act, to do something about the presence in the woods. But what could she do? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about finding answers. It was about making a choice. The return of the dog, the silence of the child, the mysterious figure in the woods, all of it pointed to something far greater than she had ever anticipated. The dog had brought the child back for a reason, but what was that reason? The house had always been a place of refuge, a sanctuary. But now, it felt like a battleground. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. It was time to face it. And whatever came next, she wouldn't be alone. The dog would be there, and the child too would play a role in what was to come. The following morning, the silence that hung over the house felt suffocating. She had barely slept, her mind racing with the strange figure in the woods and the dog's protective stance. As the sun slowly rose, casting long shadows across the yard, she stood by the window, watching the world outside. The child remained as silent as ever, their eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The dog, though still present, had taken on a new role in her life, part protector, part enigma. She felt like they were drawing closer to the heart of something. But what? What had they all come back for? It was then that she saw something that made her freeze. The ground near the old oak tree in the backyard had been disturbed. It was subtle but unmistakable. Someone, or something, had been digging. She grabbed a shovel from the shed and made her way outside, the dog following closely behind. As she approached the site, her heart began to race. The earth had been freshly turned, the soil loose and uneven. She crouched down and began to dig, each scoop of dirt feeling heavier than the last. The dog stood silently by her side, watching her every move. The deeper she dug, the more certain she became that something was buried here, something important. Finally, her shovel hit something hard. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she cleared away the rest of the dirt, revealing an old wooden box. It was weathered, worn by time, but still intact. The moment she touched it, she knew. This was the key to everything. But what was inside? With trembling hands, she opened the box, the wood creaking in protest. Inside, she found a bundle of old yellowed papers, tied together with a fraying piece of twine. There was a heavy weight in her chest as she slowly unwrapped the papers. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the first page. The writing was familiar, her own handwriting. But the words on the page didn't make sense at first. It was a letter. A letter she had written years ago, back when the child had still been with her. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," the letter began. "I didn't know what was happening. I thought I could fix everything, but I couldn't." The letter went on to describe events she barely remembered, strange occurrences, moments when she had felt as if something was wrong, but had never been able to put her finger on it. The child had been in danger, and she had failed to keep them safe. The dog, it seemed, had known long before she did. The letter ended with a final, heartbreaking line. "The dog will bring you home, and I will be waiting." The words felt like a punch to the gut. The dog had never left the child's side. It had been waiting, just like she had. The past she had locked away for so long was now flooding back, and the weight of the truth was unbearable. The discovery hit her like a flood. The letters, the buried box, it was all part of a story she had forgotten, a story she had been too afraid to remember. The child had never truly disappeared. They had been lost, hidden away, and the dog had always known where they were. But why hadn't the dog brought the child home sooner? Why had the years stretched on in silence? As she sat there in the yard, her mind racing with the questions, the dog stepped forward, sitting beside her once again. His presence was a comfort, but also a reminder of the truth she had been too scared to face. The dog's loyalty had never wavered. He had been the child's protector, and now he was hers too. The child, who had remained silent all this time, stood quietly beside them, their eyes watching her with an understanding that she couldn't explain. She wanted to ask them everything. How long had they been waiting? What had happened to them? But the child only looked at her, their face full of an unspoken patience. The answers were here, buried deep in the past, but they couldn't come in a rush. They would come slowly, piece by piece, until the whole story was revealed. She stood up slowly, her hand brushing the dog's fur, as she walked past the child. She had made a decision. It was time to stop waiting for the answers to come to her. It was time to face what had happened, and to bring the past into the light. That night, as the house settled into its usual silence, she couldn't sleep. The weight of the day's discovery hung over her like a cloud, and the questions still swirled in her mind. The child had returned, but what did it mean? The dog had brought them home, yes, but to what end? She stood by the window again, staring out into the night. The yard was quiet, but the memories were loud, loud and impossible to ignore. She thought back to the life they had shared before everything had gone wrong. The child had been a part of her world, a part of this house. And now, here they were again. But it wasn't just about the return of the child. It was about the truth of what had happened, of what had been hidden for so long. She felt like she was on the edge of something big, something that would change everything. She turned away from the window and walked towards the living room, where the dog and the child were already waiting. They had come back for a reason, and she was going to find out why. But she wasn't alone in this anymore. The dog, the child. They were part of this story now, and they would help her piece it all together. The days that followed were filled with more discoveries, more pieces of the past that had been buried, forgotten, and left behind. With each revelation, she felt like she was finally unlocking the door to the truth. The dog had always known the way, always been the keeper of the past, and now it was time for her to see it for herself. The child, though silent, seemed to understand her search, following her through the house, watching her as she uncovered old photographs, letters, and hidden memories. The connection between the three of them was undeniable. The child's silence wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge, a way for them to communicate without words, to share an understanding that went beyond language. But the truth was still elusive, just out of reach. The answers lay in the past, and the dog was the only one who could help her find them. She sat on the porch one evening, watching as the dog lay at her feet, the child beside him. The house, the yard, the very air around them seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. And she knew deep down that whatever it was coming. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't face it alone. The air felt heavy that morning, thick with unspoken words and the weight of all that had happened. She sat in the kitchen, the dog lying at her feet, while the child quietly stared out the window. Every corner of the house seemed to be waiting, as if it too were holding its breath, anticipating the moment that would finally unravel the truth. She couldn't ignore the questions any longer. The silence of the child, the dog's constant vigilance. Everything had led to this moment. It was as if they had been waiting for her to be ready, to be strong enough to face what was hidden within these walls. The dog had always been a silent protector, a keeper of secrets. But now, as she stared at the child, she realized that the time for silence was over. It was time for the truth to come to light. She stood up, a sense of determination settling over her. "It's time to talk," she said softly, more to herself than to them. The child didn't move, but the dog's ears perked up. He knew what was coming. She could feel it. Every step she took toward the child felt like stepping into the unknown, but she couldn't keep running from the truth. "I need to know everything," she whispered. The words felt heavier than she expected. The child remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the world outside the window, but she could see the subtle shift in their posture, a quiet acknowledgement that something was about to change. The dog stood up, walking slowly toward the child, his eyes never leaving her. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, until the child finally spoke. The voice was soft, hesitant, but it was the first time she had heard them speak since their return. "I've been waiting," the child said, their voice almost a whisper. "Waiting for you to remember." Her heart skipped a beat. "Waiting for me to remember," she echoed, confusion clouding her thought. The child nodded slowly, their dark eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "The dog never left me," they continued. "He was always there, always protecting me. He brought me home when it was time." She felt the weight of their words settle into her chest. This was it. The truth was beginning to surface, piece by piece. She kneeled down, her hands shaking as she reached for the child, trying to understand, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But the dog stepped forward, gently placing himself between them, as though protecting both the child and the truth. "The dog, he knew," she murmured. The dog turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she felt like he was speaking to her without words. He had always known what was happening, and now, he was here to make sure she understood too. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around her. The child's words echoed in her mind. "He brought me home when it was time." What did that mean? She couldn't understand it fully, but she knew deep down that the dog had been waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. The child had been lost, hidden away for reasons she still didn't fully comprehend, and the dog had protected them throughout it all. The years of silence, the unanswered questions, they all pointed to this moment. But the weight of the truth was overwhelming. "What happened to you?" she whispered to the child. The child looked down at the floor, their expression pained. "I was lost," they said quietly. "Not in the way you think, but in a way I couldn't understand." The words were cryptic, but there was an emotion behind them that struck her to the core. The child wasn't just physically lost. They had been lost in a deeper sense, disconnected from something vital. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her mind. "Where did you go?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why didn't you come back?" The child's eyes lifted to meet hers, a look of quiet sorrow in their gaze. "I never left," they said. "I was always here, waiting for you to find me." The dog's low growl rumbled softly in the background, as if urging her to listen. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The child had never left. They had always been here, waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to remember. The weight of the child's words settled over her, but the confusion remained. "You were always here? But how?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fear. The child didn't answer immediately. Instead, they stood and walked toward the window, their gaze lost in the distance once more. The dog followed them, sitting patiently at their feet. The woman remained seated, her mind racing, trying to process what she had just learned. How could the child have been here all along? Where had they been? And why hadn't she noticed? "You were lost," the child said softly, as though speaking to themselves. "I wasn't lost in the way you think, but I couldn't find my way back until now." The words were like pieces of a puzzle, but they didn't quite fit together. The dog had always been the bridge, the protector, but what had kept the child from speaking, from returning, all these years? It was as though the dog had kept them hidden until the right time had come. And now, it was time. But what would happen next? The child turned to face her again, their expression no longer distant. "It's time to make things right," they said, their voice steady, as though they had known this moment would come. The dog's eyes met hers once more, and she felt the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come. The house felt different now, the air thick with the weight of what had been revealed. The dog, ever watchful, remained close to the child, his eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. She stood, her mind still reeling, but there was no turning back now. The pieces of the past had fallen into place, but the truth was far more complex than she had imagined. The child had never left. They had been lost in ways she couldn't fully grasp, but they had been waiting. Waiting for her to find them. Waiting for the moment when everything would come together. And now, she understood. The dog had never stopped guarding them, never stopped waiting. The child, in their silence, had been waiting for her to be ready to hear the truth. But what was the truth? It was bigger than just a lost child or a loyal dog. It was about forgiveness, redemption, and the scars left by the past. She turned to the dog who stood beside the child, as though waiting for her to make the next move. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of understanding. "We'll fix this," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "We'll make it right." And with those words, she knew that the path forward had finally revealed itself. The dog, the child, and the house, they were all part of this journey. And now, together, they would face whatever came next. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the floor. The house, once filled with questions and uncertainty, now felt like a place of quiet reflection. She sat at the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the child and the dog, who were both seated by the window, looking out at the world, as if seeing it for the first time. The weight of everything that had come before, the mystery, the secrets, the silence, had finally started to lift. The truth had been uncovered, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The child had spoken, and now the air in the house seemed less heavy. They had been waiting for her to remember, to understand. And now that they had, it was time to move forward. The dog, ever the silent protector, had brought the child back to her when the time was right. But what did it all mean now? What would happen next? She couldn't ignore the past, but she no longer needed to be bound by it. The child had come home. Then, the dog had kept its promise. And now, she was ready to rebuild. The silence that had once been so suffocating was now a comforting presence, a shared understanding between them. "We're home," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. And for the first time in a long time it felt true. As the days passed, the house began to change in subtle ways. The shadows that had once seemed to loom in every corner now felt like distant memories. The child's silence had shifted into a quiet understanding, and the dog, ever vigilant, seemed content to watch over them both. The house, which had once felt like a prison of secrets, was now a home once more. She found herself walking through the rooms with a sense of calm that had eluded her for years. The past still lingered, but it no longer had control over her. The child, though still quiet, began to interact more, as though the weight of their return had finally been lifted. The bond between them, the dog, the child and her, had solidified in ways she couldn't fully explain. It was as though they were all a part of something greater, something unspoken, but deeply understood. The child would often sit by the window, watching the outside world. But now there was a sense of peace in their stillness. The dog would rest beside them, ever watchful, but content. And she too had found a quiet place in her heart, to finally heal. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were no longer open. They were scars, faded but not forgotten. The house had become a home again, filled with the quiet presence of love and understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, she found herself standing on the porch, looking out at the yard. The dog sat beside her, his familiar presence a comfort. The child was inside, playing quietly, as though they had found their place in the world once more. The events of the past few weeks had left their mark, but they had also brought something unexpected: hope. The child's return had forced her to confront the darkness of the past, but it had also given her the chance to heal, to make amends for things she hadn't been able to change. The dog had been a constant throughout it all, guarding them both, waiting for the right moment to bring them together. And now, here they were. The future, once uncertain, was now full of possibilities. The dog, always silent, but always present, had brought them home. She felt the weight of gratitude, of love, settle deep within her heart. "We're okay now," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "We're going to be okay." The dog's eyes met hers, calm and reassuring. And for the first time in years she believed it. Life moved forward in its quiet rhythm. The house was no longer a place of hidden secrets, but a sanctuary of healing and growth. The child had found their voice, though it remained soft and measured. They had stories to tell, but they would speak them when they were ready. And she too had stories to share, but now she understood that the time for those stories would come when the moment was right. The dog remained by their side, his loyalty unshaken, his presence a constant reminder that they were never alone. The house had seen the scars of their past, but it also witnessed the strength they had found in each other. The child no longer sat by the window for hours, lost in thought. Instead, they had begun to explore, to engage with the world outside. It was as if they were starting anew, with a fresh perspective. And the dog, ever the protector, watched over them with the same quiet dedication that had brought them here. Together, they had healed. Together they had found peace. The house, once filled with silence, was now filled with the soft sounds of life, laughter, conversation, and the warmth of a family reunited. The final piece had fallen into place. The journey had been long, and at times painful, but it had led them here to this moment of quiet peace. The dog had kept his promise. The child had returned. And she had finally come to terms with the past. There was no more waiting, no more searching. The family had been reunited, not just by blood, but by the bonds of love, loyalty, and forgiveness. She stood by the window one last time, looking out at the world beyond. The dog sat beside her, his presence a steady comfort. The child was outside, laughing in the yard, their joy filling the air. And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. She turned away from the window and looked at the dog, who turned his head to meet her gaze. "You kept your promise," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. The dog's tail gave a small wag, as if acknowledging her gratitude. They had all come home. And in that moment, she realized that this, right here, was all she needed. The past was gone, and the future was theirs to shape.